There is a strip of water 21 miles wide at its narrowest point that sits between Iran and Oman. It doesn't look like much on a map. You could drive across it in under 30 minutes. And yet, right now, that strip of water is holding the global economy as hostage. Roughly 20 million barrels of oil pass through it every single day. That's 1/5 of all the oil consumed on Earth. Gone just like that. Right now, as you watch this, gas price in America went $4 per gallon. Fertilizer prices are up 50%. Shipping companies around the world are rerouting their entire fleets to avoid this one narrow passage. But here is what I want you to understand. This crisis didn't start in 2026. This crisis was always coming because the Strait of Hormuz is not just a choke point for oil, it's a choke point for the entire architecture of modern world. And we built that architecture deliberately on top of the most geopolitically unstable piece of real estate on the planet. Today, we're going to go one layer below that headlines and understand why. Let's start with the geography, because everything else flows from here. The Strait of Hormuz is about 104 miles long. At its narrowest, it's 21 nautical miles across. But here's the part that matters. The actual shipping lanes, the lanes where oil tankers travel, are only 2 miles wide in each direction. 2 miles. You're talking about super tankers, ships the size of small city blocks carrying 2 million barrels of crude oil each, navigating a corridor barely wider than some city avenues. And those lanes sit largely in Omani territorial waters, but they are flanked on the northern side entirely by Iran. Iran has naval bases there, it has missile batteries there, it has Revolutionary Guard speedboats that practice swarming exercise in those waters. Every single ship that moves oil out of the Persian Gulf from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, the UAE, Qatar has to sail within the sight of Iranian territory. And here's the thing about geography. You can't sanction it, you can't bomb it into a different shape. But it's not just oil, because modern supply chains are interlocked in ways that aren't obvious from the surface. About a third of world's internationally traded fertilizer moves through this strait. The Gulf produces roughly 30 to 35% of global urea and 20 to 30% of ammonia. When that stops moving, the world's farms start to feel it. Not next year, not next month, right now, during planting season in the northern hemisphere. We are not talking about an energy crisis anymore. We're talking about a food crisis, a supply chain crisis, a financial crisis, all flowing from one 21-mile strip of water. But how did one waterway get this much power over the global economy? The answer isn't just geography. It's the decisions made over 50 years to concentrate the world's energy production in one of the most volatile regions on Earth. Here is something that the news isn't telling you. The world has been here before. Not exactly here, but close enough that it should have been a warning. Go back to 1973, the Arab oil embargo. OPEC cuts off oil to the US and Western Europe as punishment for supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Gas lines stretch around the block in America. The economy convulses. And for the first time, the world realizes we have built our entire industrial civilization on oil that we don't control, and that oil flowing through waters that we don't own. And what did the world do with that realization? Mostly nothing. The dependency deepened even more. Fast forward to 1980, Iraq invades Iran. The Iran-Iraq War begins, a grinding 8-year conflict that kills hundreds of thousands of people. By 1984, both sides have a new strategy. Attack the other's oil infrastructure, attack the tankers, attack Kharg Island, Iran's main oil terminal, the same island that American forces struck in 2026. This became known as the Tanker War. Iran and Iraq attacked a combined 451 ships between 1981 and 1988. Iran used speedboats, mines, and shore-based missiles. On the other hand, Iraq used French-supplied Exocet missiles fired from jets. Kuwait, terrified of Iranian attacks on its tankers, went to both Soviet Union and the US asking for protection. The Americans, desperate to prevent Soviet Unions in the Gulf, agreed. They reflagged Kuwaiti tankers as American vessels and sent the US Navy to escort them through the strait. Operation Earnest Will, 1987. American warships in the Persian Gulf escorting oil tankers past Iranian threats. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and right now it's rhyming very loudly. The strait has never, not once, not even in 1987, been fully closed. Not until now. Or rather, not until the threat of closure alone was enough to shut down over 90% of tanker traffic through sheer fear and skyrocketing insurance costs. Before this 2026 war on Iran, that is imposed by the US and Israeli forces, shipping insurance for a transit through the Strait of Hormuz cost about 0.1 to 5% of the ship's value. Within days of the conflict starting, guess how much that price went up? 0.2 to 4%. That's more than double. Then it jumped again by 4 to 6 times in a single week. For supertankers, that's $250,000 just for one passage through a 21-mile stretch of water. And there are reports suggest that Iran is right now charging up to $2 million per tanker just to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, which was free in all those years before this US and Israeli imposed war on Iran. So we understand the geography, we understand the history, but the deeper question is, who does this actually hurt? The answer is not who most people think. Here's the thing most people get wrong about the Strait of Hormuz. They think this is primarily America's problem. It isn't, not directly. In 2025, approximately 89% of all crude oil and condensate transiting in the Strait of Hormuz was destined almost for Asia. China received about 37% of all Hormuz crude alone, more than the next three importers combined. India received 14%, South Korea 12%, and Japan about 11%. The US, by contrast, received about 2.5% of Hormuz crude flows in the first quarter of 2025. America's shale revelation has made it largely energy dependent. The US produces more oil than it consumes. So, when Donald Trump talks about the Strait of Hormuz, he is not worried about the American gas station running dry. He is worried about the price, because oil is a globally priced commodity. When the strait closes, prices spike everywhere, even in countries that don't import Gulf oil directly. The US is not immune to a $126 per barrel oil price or even more. But the countries that bleed most, China, India, Japan, South Korea, these are the economies that absolutely depend on this narrow strip of water to keep their factories running, their cities lit, and their supply chains moving. And now, look at China's position. China is Iran's largest oil customer. It has massive economic interest in the Gulf, but China hasn't intervened yet. China isn't mediating. China is just watching, importing some Iranian oil that's still trickling through and letting the US and Israel bear the military diplomatic cost of the conflict. That's a strategic calculation, not a coincidence. And then there is the dimension that almost no one is reporting on, the fertilizer crisis. The Gulf doesn't just export oil, it exports roughly 1/3 of the world's seaborne fertilizer trade, urea, ammonia, and the nitrogen compounds that modern industrial farming runs on. Since the strait closed, urea prices jumped from $482 per ton to $720 per ton. Ammonia up 24%. This is happening in March-April, planting season in the northern hemisphere. The Kiel Institute estimates that food prices in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and India could rise 10 to 15% under a full closure scenario. Some developing nations could see harvest reductions of up to 50%. A war in the Middle East, an oil embargo in the Gulf, a food crisis in the South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, all connected through one choke point, all traceable back to 21 miles of water. So if the closure hurts China the most and China isn't acting, then what's actually holding the whole system together? And is there any alternative at all? Every time the Strait of Hormuz crisis comes up, someone says, but what about the alternatives? What about the pipelines? Let me be direct. There are alternatives, but they're not feasible. They're grossly and almost comically insufficient. Saudi Arabia has its east-west pipeline running from the Gulf oil fields to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. Capacity 5 million barrels per day. Temporarily expanded to 7 million in 2019. The UAE has a pipeline connecting to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman. Capacity 1.5 million barrels per day. Even Iran built a pipeline to the port of Jask in 2021, but has never operationally used it. Combined bypass capacity is about 2.6 to 4 million barrels per day. depending on the operational structure. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day. The math doesn't work, not even close. You would need to find about 15 to 17 million barrels of oil per day from somewhere else in the world, and that somewhere else simply doesn't exist. And it gets worse. The UAE built a storage facility in Fujairah, the world's largest crude oil storage, specifically to reduce dependence on the strait. In March 2026, Iranian drones struck in Dakam and Salalah, two of the key bypass ports on Oman's coast outside the strait. The alternative exists were attacked too. And remember, none of these pipelines carry fertilizer. There is no east-west pipeline for ammonia. There is no bypass route for urea. If you need Gulf fertilizer to reach global markets, it has to go through the Strait of Hormuz. There is literally no other way. This is what I mean by structural fragility. It was engineered into the system. Governments knew, economists knew, even military personnel knew. And still, the world continued to centralize its energy production in the Persian Gulf and route it through a single passage that one country, Iran, can threaten to close whenever its survival feels at stake. Which brings us back to the fundamental question: how do we reopen the Strait of Hormuz? That's the news headline. The real question is, why was the world's energy system designed with a single point of failure, and what would it actually take to change that? But again, the Hormuz isn't closed. It's open, it's just closed for US and Israeli tankers. Now, here's the uncomfortable truth at the end of all this. The Strait of Hormuz was always going to be this. It was always a crisis waiting for an ignition. Every time there has been a scare, in 1973, in 1984, 2019 when Iran seized tankers, 2025 when the 12-day war happened, the world breathed a sigh of relief when it didn't escalate and then went right back to building the same dependency deeper. Because the strait is cheap, the strait is convenient, oil flows, and the price is manageable. The global economy grows on top of this geological accident. This 21-mile strip of water that someone decided 50 years ago should be the load-bearing column for the entire industrial world. The Strait of Hormuz is not the world's most dangerous choke point because it's narrow. It's dangerous because what we have built on this narrowness. Because of the decisions we made decade after decade to route more and more of the world's energy, food, and trade through a corridor controlled by a country in permanent conflict with the Western-led order and a war of choice imposed by the US and Israel. And that's the story of the Strait of Hormuz. Not just what's happening, but why it was always going to happen.